And if you have the Tanya in front of you, we're on page 30, using page numbers at the bottom of the page. And if not, I'm going to stick it onto the screen. Now we're in the middle. You see, I've got somebody sitting over here who's very, very keen to hear the answer to a question that is sort of lingering from last week. So that's why I was very urgent to make sure that we could still have a share, even though people are away. You know, you can't leave certain questions lingering because they're just too important. So what question am I referring to? Well, in the previous section, what we learned about is we've been talking about the concept of klippa, the concept of impurity, and how there are different kinds of impurity, how there's klippas noiga, those things that have potential, and they are what we call mutar. In other words, there's a possibility to free them from a state of impurity and to be able to make them pure again. And then there are things that are completely stuck. And so the difference for us is, if we engage with something in our lives which is part of the klippas noiga, so even if our motivation is not 100% correct, and even if our experience is not 100% as holy or meaningful or spiritual as it should be, there's always the opportunity to recuperate afterwards and to recover the experience afterwards, because it is always possible for a person to do Teshuvah. Well, we'll talk about Teshuvah in a second, but there's always the possibility, let's say for argument's sake, the classic example that we used was a person eating food. The food is kosher, but the intention is not so kosher. So the person's eating food, but they don't necessarily focus on serving Hashem, they just focus on enjoying themselves. So shortly after that, a person can go ahead and learn Torah or do a mitzvah or daven or whatever, using the energy that was absorbed into their system by this food. And just like that, it transforms the food from being something which had a negative energy to something which has an extremely positive, holy energy associated with it. So that's what we learned last week. Then we said, on the other hand, if a person engages with something which is absolute klippa, which is absolute impurity, something which is forbidden by the Torah, well then it's like trying to swallow lead. You know, it's just going to take a person in one direction. It's like wearing those wonderful boots that the mafia gives you. You know, there's only one direction to go when a person is involved with that kind of impurity, and that's down. And we used a very strong expression and an almost frightening expression, which it was the word lo'olam. We said that's how it is. It's irrevocable, isn't it? There's no reprieve, there's no return, there's no rehabilitation. When a person is stuck, they're stuck. When a situation is impure, it is incurable. That's what we learned last time. And then we said but, which is a classic Jewish thing to do. Say, this is absolute, but there might actually be an exception. Right? So it's absolute that a person is going to be stuck in a state of impurity, or that their action is going to be stuck in a state of impurity, but there's a way out, right? There's a way out. Okay, what's the way out? So what's it? Yeah, no problem. Just as long as you have the intention to use it in order to stay awake during the Tanya Shir, then it becomes elevated into the world of purity and holiness. Right? Yeah, exactly. We said when you're learning, right? On Shabbos we learned that when you are learning, then you're allowed to eat and drink in the shul. When you're not learning, it's very questionable if you're ever permitted to eat or drink in a shul. Okay, that was what we were learning about on Shabbos. Yeah, good catch, Hilton. Thank you. Shkoyach. So there's the big but. Le'olam. This is absolutely stuck and trapped, and there's no way out, and it's contaminated and it's toxic. But it's page 30. What's the but? But there is going to come a time where the whole world will change, and things as they are defined in our current reality will not be the reality of that period of time. It's called the time of Mashiach. And one of the big factors of the time of Mashiach is that Hashem will banish death from the world, and Hashem will remove the spirit of impurity from the world. And those are synonymous. The concept of death and the concept of impurity are synonymous. So, if you live in a world where impurity is part and parcel of that world, then it is possible that certain impurities are a one-way valve and there's no way out, that they can be so toxic, so poisonous, so destructive that you can't undo the reality. But if the whole world changes and the whole reality of existence changes, so that now there is no such thing as impurity. Okay, well then how can you be stuck in impurity if there's no longer such things as impurity? So that's the one possibility. And that possibility really says we have little control. We have to wait. We have to wait until that period emerges, and then the world will change, and then a person who may have been trapped not only for a lifetime, but even a soul that may have been trapped because of very heinous behavior during their lifetime, they'll actually be released when Mashiach comes to. And then we said there's a second possibility, and this is where the big question comes from. And that's when we said, so let's read it again. Okay, so if you're looking inside the actual book, so it is almost exactly in the middle, it's maybe a little bit above the middle of the page. Oi, ad, sheyasa tshuva gedola, okay? So it's not really in the middle of the page, probably about 12 lines down, and if you're looking on the screen, it is the second line, the second last word, oi. Oi, alternatively, there's an alternative way that a person is able to rehabilitate themselves, and that is ad sheyaseh teshuvah gedola. That's where we left off last week. Unless a person does teshuvah gedola, great teshuvah. Now, the truth of the matter is that what I did last week was not correct. You know, anybody who's ever either had a good English teacher in their lives, or a person who was an English teacher, so you understand that grammar makes a difference. So I don't know if you saw recently, there was a meme going around that says the average North American eats, how did it go? The average North American eats 400 Africans or something to that effect. But really what they wanted to say was eats the equivalent of 400 Africans. But the grammar wasn't that clean. So it comes out as if they're cannibals, right? That's the famous book, Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, right? So the grammar makes a difference. So in the same way, over here, what I did last week was completely inappropriate, but we were out of time. We didn't have the opportunity to study this properly. So I actually stopped with the grammar deliberately in the wrong place. So last week we ended off saying, until the person does a great type of teshuvah. But that's actually not what the Alter Rebbe says. He says, teshuvah gedola kol kach. It's the only other way that a person could rehabilitate themselves is if they do teshuvah that is great to the extent that something is going to happen. So actually, that's where the definition lies. This is where Michael has been waiting, right? This is where the definition lies. That it's until a person does teshuvah that is so great that something is going to happen. Okay, now in order to understand this, there are two really important elements to this conversation that we have to unpack before we can actually just read what the Alter Rebbe is saying. The first is, we need to discuss Aveiras. When I say we need to discuss Aveiras, I don't mean we should be giving each other suggestions. Try this one. I don't know if you've ever done it before. It's actually quite right. I don't mean discuss Aveiras like that. Nor do I mean that we should discuss Aveiras as in, what have you done? What have you done? Rather, just to understand what is an Aveira and what are the different types of Aveira that exist. That's the first thing that we have to discuss in order to have this conversation. The second, even more important, that's a very important conversation. The second, even more important part of the conversation is to understand what Teshuvah is. Now, unfortunately, we don't generally have a good handle on what Aveiros are, and we don't typically have a decent understanding of what Teshuvah is. And because of that, we run into problems. So, in medical terms, we all know that identifying the disease correctly is a major step of progress towards cure. So, but if there's a misdiagnosis, how could there be cure? And sadly, anybody who's had the experience of a misdiagnosis, then you know what kind of havoc that could wreak. By the time you come around to the correct diagnosis, it could, God forbid, be too late. It's no different in spiritual terms. If we don't have an accurate diagnosis for Aveiras, then we don't know how to cure them. So let's talk a little bit about this, and you'll see how the two dovetail. What's wrong with an Avera? I know it's a funny thing for a rabbi to ask, yes?
Everything's wrong.
What's wrong with an Avera? What do you say? Everything's wrong with an Avera. Okay, but let's be a little bit more specific. So why don't do an Avera? Why not?
Damages relationship.
Okay.
What's that?
And so there's one angle of an Avera.
Yes.
An Avera damages relationships.
Between man and man and man and
Correct.
Yeah, that's right.
So right, Averas damage the relationships between people and damage the relationships between the individual and God. Sometimes there are different types of Averas that do the different types of damage. Sometimes the same Avera can damage both elements.
could also just damage the individual.
Okay, so the first thing is that an Avera damages relationships. Relationships with people, relationships with God. Then the Avera damages the person. Now let's unpack that. What do you mean an Avera damages a person? So it's an accurate statement. Now let's understand, what does it mean?
Brings an impurity into the being.
Okay, good. So what happens when a person does an Avera? It attracts impurity into their life. Okay, you notice I changed the word slightly. It brings it brings impurity into their life. Okay, now let's think about this for a second. Which of the following would be the most accurate description in an allegorical way for the effects of an Avera? Okay, well, let's look at a few examples. Example number one. A person doesn't realize that it's been raining. They walk outside, they slip, and they land up in the mud. Is that a good representation of what an Avera is like?
No,
No, why not?
because there was no intent. That's accidental.
Okay, so that was accidental. Right? So the person had no intention to go swimming in the mud. The person went outside with a lack of awareness. With a lack of awareness. And due to that lack of awareness, they landed up in the mud. Fair? So is that like an Avera? Could there be an Avera like that?
Yes.
Yeah, of course there could. Person does an Avera with a lack of awareness. Of course it's possible. So what happens to the person who slips and falls in the mud due to a lack of awareness? So what do they do now?
It's still in the mud.
So what do?
Clean it.
Get out of the mud, first of all. First of all, you've got to get out of the mud. It doesn't help for a person to sit there in the mud and say, listen, it's not my fault. I didn't choose to be this way. Okay, but you've got to get out of the mud. That's the most pragmatic thing. Doesn't matter whether there was or was not intent. If you're in the mud, get out of the mud. Does it help to get out of the mud? No, that's only the first step. The next step is that you've actually got to clean the clothing, change the clothing first, so that you can clean those clothing. Clean your body, so that you can go out now looking like a mensch. Would anybody suggest, though, that the mud has become a permanent part of who you are?
No.
No, but there's a third step. And
What's the
that's
third
being
step?
aware.
Being more aware in the future. Yes, excellent point. You have to be more aware in the future. But even before that, I hate to say this, but in today's world, in many places in the world, there is the chance that your little mishap in the mud was recorded on CCTV. And you don't necessarily know that. And for all you know, there's some security guard who replays it every day for the laughs. And you don't even know this. It's possible. In today's world, highly possible. You have any idea how many videos circulate on YouTube of people doing exactly that? So it's not so simple, right? Is it part of your life? No. But is it on record? Yes. So, on the first thing you've got to do is you've got to get out of the mud. The second thing you've got to do is you've got to be willing to clean up. The third thing you've got to do is be more aware and consider in the future that you don't repeat the same mistake. Otherwise, you're really an idiot, you know. So you see, sometimes you see exactly those kinds of videos where the person goes outside, slips on the ice, and the person behind them does exactly what they did. So, unfortunately, just because a person has had an experience, what's that? So, unfortunately, just because somebody has had an experience does not necessarily mean that they'll learn from the experience. But then there's another layer. How do I make sure that I don't have this record of looking like a Meshuggah? That's another story, right? You know, go back and look and with the cameras, whatever. But even if there is a record on camera, and even if that goes viral on the internet, it's still not part of me. It might be part of a segment of my life. It's not part of me. Next example. What happens if a person goes outside, does not realize that it's been raining, slips in the mud, and fractures their wrist? Now what? Now it's not just a matter of you've got to clean up and be more careful in the future and get out of the mud, check the CCTV. Now there is a physical damage that the person has experienced, and the nature of that wound is that it will be for all time a weakness in their body. That part of the wrist is now going to be a more vulnerable part of the body for the rest of the person's life. Right? So what do? Now what do?
You've got to get it fixed.
You got to go get it fixed, right? So you get your, the person's got to have their arm in a cast, and what else do they have to do? They're going to have to go for physio, or to the biokineticist, or wherever they got to go, and they're going to have to build up strength in the muscles and tendons and ligaments around their wrist, because the wrist, the bone structure of the wrist now has been compromised. So you've got to build up strength around that part of the body to make sure that it is less susceptible to damage in the future. You know what the irony is? It's possible that that part of the person may become the strongest part of the person. So let's say the person fell on their left wrist. It might emerge in the coming months and years that their left wrist will be much tougher than their right wrist, because that's where they'll be doing all the work. That's where they'll be doing all the physio. That's where they'll be doing all the stuff, right? So now, the fact that it was inadvertent did not change any of the consequences. The consequences are the same. It was intentional or unintentional. The fact is the person fractured their wrist. How they behave afterwards makes a massive difference. So the person just says, listen, I've got to go through the X amount of time that the hand is immobilized, and then I've got to, wear a cast for that period of time and have the inconvenience of not being able to use that hand, etc. But then after that, I'm fine. So there's no net gain from the experience. Whereas the person who now works with that part of their body to build strength actually comes out with a net gain from a bad experience. Now, Teshuvah works something like that. One of the great parables that we use to describe Teshuvah is the parable of a rope that snaps. The Alter Rebbe will talk about it much, much later on in Tanya, in a section called the Teshuvah, which is the whole analysis of how Teshuvah works. But over there he says, what happens if you have a rope that snaps? That part of the rope going forward will become the strongest part of the rope, because in order to rehabilitate the rope, you've got to tie that section back together again. So where there was a weakness in the rope, there's actually now a knot. That's actually now the strong part of the rope, because you've had to rehabilitate it. And that's what Teshuvah is supposed to do for us. The objective of Teshuvah is not simply to get up and clean off the mud. The objective of Teshuvah is not just to learn a lesson so that I don't follow the same stupidity again in the future. The objective of Teshuvah is to have a net gain out of the experience. How do you get a net gain? So that's what we've got to analyze. In order to analyze this, we have to understand that there are three types of aveiras that a person could do. The first kind of aveira that a person can do doesn't really count as an aveira. So that's something which is completely accidental. Now, is it possible for a person to do something damaging accidentally? Of course it is. Of course it is. It happens all the time. Let's say, for argument's sake, an example we can all relate to. Touched on it last time. Person wakes up from their Shabbos shlof. They're still groggy. And as they're getting out of bed, they flip the light switch. Afterwards, 5 minutes later, when they're awake, because there's something that they call, what do they call it? Sleep inertia. You heard of this? Sleep inertia. Whatever it is, 15 minutes or so after a person wakes up, they're not necessarily properly awake, especially if you've been in a deep sleep. So 5, 10, 15 minutes later, they come back into the room, they're like, who turned on the light? They have no recollection of the fact that it happened. That would qualify as what we call oines, which means that the action was completely accidental and there's no liability for the person. There's technically no teshuvah needed. Technically, because you didn't do anything wrong. You weren't even aware of what you did. But if a guy slipped in the mud, that was also accidental. Nobody in their right mind is going to say, listen, it's not your fault, you don't have to clean up. So the law does not require teshuvah in that case, but any sensitive person is going to want to clean up somehow, and they need to learn how. The next level of Aveira is what is called shoigeg. Shoigeg means inadvertent. Now what's the difference between accidental and inadvertent? This person wakes up from their Shabbos shlof, and you know how it is when you've been in a very deep sleep, particularly if a person has a sleep during the day, it's often more disorienting than a nighttime sleep. So a person wakes up from their shlof and they can't remember what day of the week it is. Ever had that experience?
Yeah.
You wake up, you can't remember what day of the week it is.
Yeah.
So the person wakes up from their Shabbos shlof thinking it's Wednesday. Okay, it's Wednesday. Turn on the light switch. Did they intend to turn on the light switch?
They intended to turn on the light.
They intended to turn on the light switch. So it is what we call meleches machsheves. One of the prerequisites of breaking Shabbos is conscious action. It was a conscious action. But it was inadvertent because their mind told them it's Wednesday. Is there liability for that? Is the person going to be, so to speak, held responsible or punished? I hate that word. Punished for breaking Shabbos? No.
I would say no.
No? No, you can't punish a person for something which is inadvertent. But is the damage done? Does a person like that have to do teshuvah? 100% resounding yes. We should know it from this week's parasha. This week's parasha is the parasha of korbanos, of the offerings that they used to bring in the temple. One of those offerings was called the chatas offering, nothing to do at all with a braai. So the chatas offering, the korban chatas, was an offering a person could only bring for an inadvertent sin.
Yeah, but the sin has been done.
Correct. Why is it considered a sin? Because there was a conscious intention. There was no conscious intention to sin, but there was a conscious intention to do that action. Therefore, I have to own that action. Now, it subsequently emerges that that action was inappropriate, so I've got to fix it. Again, if I'm walking down the street and there's a pebble lying in the road that I don't see, and I kick the pebble, and the pebble flies out and cracks somebody's window. It's completely accidental. But everybody would agree that I've got to make good on the window. It was completely accidental.
But you didn't have to do teshuvah because it was unintentional.
Correct. I'm just illustrating that we'd all agree there's some degree of liability even for an accident. So if I had conscious intention, and here's an interesting example, by the way, that the Gemara talks about. So let's say that I've got a rock in my hand because, I don't know, I'm protesting or something like that. So I've got a rock in my hand. And the intention is, because I'm protesting as one does in the 21st century, so what do? I'm going to throw a rock at a police car. Which is like a mashugana thought, but, So my plan is to throw the rock at a police car. As I throw the rock, Nebuch, Somebody walks in front of the police car, gets hit by the rock in the head. Not only am I liable for their medical bills, there's a criminal case. Because I had conscious intention to do a negligent act in a public place. So that's the difference between accidental and inadvertent. Accidental means there's no conscious intention. Inadvertent means I had conscious intention, but I wasn't aware of what that intention would result in. Therefore, I still have to do Teshuvah.
But surely there's a difference between something that's damaging and something that's not. Turning on a light switch, there's no damage that can possibly come from it.
Right.
There are other Beirut where there is damage that can
Correct. Good point.
even if it was inadvertent.
Good point. So, bearing in mind that you were the one who said earlier that an Avera can damage the person. So, talking about, just to repeat the question for those who didn't hear it, so the question is, if you're describing a scenario of actual damage either to property or to person, then it's very clear that the perpetrator is responsible for the damage, even if they don't have to, so to speak, do Teshuvah because it was inadvertent or it was accidental. How do you compare that to an Avera that is innocuous because nobody gets harmed? Now, one of the biggest distinctions between Torah values and modern values is that modern values teach us very clearly that really you could do as you please as long as you don't harm anybody else in the process. And Torah values say that there are a whole lot of things that you can't do despite the fact that they don't harm anybody else or anybody else's property.
I've got a rock in my hand and I want to throw it at that guy to hurt him.
Right.
And I throw it and I miss him. I've done
Yes.
no damage.
Yes.
But I had every intention of
Right.
doing it. So where do I stand?
Okay, so I'll come to that in a second. So in Torah values, the fact is that there is spiritual damage that is as weighty as physical damage. And in the same way as the Torah does not allow me to damage myself or my own property physically, equally I'm not allowed to damage myself spiritually. So in the same way as the Torah would not allow me to take a book off my bookshelf and rip it to shreds, because there's a law called Bal Tashchis that you're not allowed to damage, but it's mine, I paid for it, it's mine, I can do as I please. No, you can't. Fascinating law, right? It's a totally different approach to conventional thinking. Conventional thinking says you didn't harm anybody else, it's your property, do as you please. Torah says, no, you have a moral responsibility to behave like a mensch, which includes the fact that you can't destroy your own property, and by extension, you can't destroy your own body. That's why suicide in Judaism is equated to murder. Because you could say you're not harming anybody else, it doesn't matter. Self-harm is as severe as harm to others.
Tattoos.
Okay, tattoos is not necessarily an issue of physical harm. Not necessarily an issue of physical harm, but it certainly would be an issue of spiritual harm.
Of the physical body.
Well, you could say that it fits into the category of not doing damage to things that are ours, except the damage of there wouldn't necessarily be physical. It would be much more spiritual, and we can get into why that is. But the principle, so there's two fundamental principles in Judaism that distinguish Jewish values, or Torah values, from worldly values. A, the fact that it's mine, in my jurisdiction, my property does not excuse my behavior. B, spiritual damage is at least as serious as physical damage, and most likely more serious. So just to use an example to illustrate exactly that point about it being more serious. So let's talk about this. We're told that if a person embarrasses another person, it's a miniature form of murder. Right? It's what even in today's world we'll use the expression character assassination. So we understand that it's a form of murder. But it's still a form of physical murder because the person has the physical sensations associated with being a victim. Elevated heart rate, the blood drains from their face, whatever the various things are that happen to the person. So that is associated with a miniature form of death. But there are a number of teachings in Judaism where a person could cause spiritual death to somebody else. Now, it's a bit of an abstract concept for us, this concept of spiritual death, but it is a possibility. And spiritual death is where a person robs somebody else of their spiritual life. Okay? So, for example, just to go back, the very first time that the Torah speaks about murder, anybody know where that is? The very first time that the Torah speaks about murder. Interestingly, it's before Cain and Abel. Right? Interesting. So we're told that that Hashem gave 6 laws to Adam, and then at the time of Noach he added a 7th law, and one of those laws that was given to Adam was the law against murder. Now what the Torah says when it describes murder is as follows: Shoifech dam ha'adam, he who spills the blood of another human, ba'adam damo yishafech, should have their blood spilt by a human. In other words, capital punishment. Okay?
And
you want to hear?
The commandment is so often mistranslated.
Completely.
And kill is the most...
Kill is a terrible word. Correct. Murder and kill. It's so easily conflated. So now listen to the mystical explanation of that verse. Shoifech dam ha'adam ba'adam. Again, grammar, right? Where you put the punctuation. Shoifech dam ha'adam ba'adam. There are those who shed the blood of a man with a man. What does that mean? So in the Torah, we have times that we refer to Hashem as Adam Ha'elyon, the supreme or supernal man. And we have times where we refer to the Yetzer Hara as the Adam B'li'al, which is like the reprehensible or the what do you call it? The lowly man. It's not a great word. B'li'al is like something which is...
Bli is without.
Huh?
Bli.
No, it's with an I in, so it's one word. B'li'al is like disgusting and lowly and corrupted and toxic. Shoifech dam ha'adam with a hey ha'yedi'ah, the definite article, the man, that refers to God. Ba'adam with the little man, the Adam B'li'al means... When a person does an Aveira, they suck the life of God out of their neshama. So the Adam Ha'elyon, the supernal man that is supposed to invigorate my soul, is now replaced with the passion and enthusiasm I have for the rubbish that the Yetzer Hara wants me to follow. That's spiritual death. Spiritual death is to suck out the lifeblood of the neshama and replace it with the vicissitudes of this world. That is considered worse than physical murder. Why? Because if a person is murdered physically, we know this from the story of Miriam. So Miriam was the oldest of 3 children, but at the time of this story, she was only the elder of 2 children. And Pharaoh makes his decree that all of the Jewish boys are going to be thrown into the Nile, so her parents divorce. Her father at that time was the leader of the Jewish people. His name was Amram. And he says, we can't bring children into such a world. How can you bring children into a world where there's a pretty good chance they're going to be killed? Miriam, who at that time is all of 6 years old, goes to her father and says, you got this all wrong. You got this all wrong. Number 1, you are a tzaddik, and Paroi is a wicked individual. Therefore, what you say will for sure work, what he says may not work. So you separating from my mother is going to be an example to the rest of the Jewish nation. Everybody's going to separate. There'll be no Jewish children. And that's for sure going to happen because you're a righteous man. Pharaoh says he's going to kill the children. Who says he's going to be able to do it? He's a wicked man. Number 2, if you kill the children, they might still get into the next world. If you don't allow the children to be born, how will they ever get into Gan Eden? So she says to him, your decree is more severe than Pharaoh's decree. Spiritual death is far more severe than physical death. Physical death, okay, so the person dies. It's a horrible thing. It's a tragedy for us. For the neshama continues. And the neshama lives at a higher reality and has access to Gan Eden, etc. But kill somebody spiritually, God forbid, it's a dead end. Now, because in Judaism, now you put these two Torah values together, damage to self is as bad as damage to others. And spiritual damage is at least as severe as physical damage, if not worse. So then if you flip a light switch on a Shabbos, it's more damaging to the neshama than inadvertently throwing a stone through the wrong window. Right? Throwing a stone through the wrong window inadvertently, okay, so what did you do? You damaged the window. You pay for the window. Everything's resolved. Turning the light on Shabbos means there's a part of my neshama now that got sucked into inappropriate behavior. It wasn't intentional, but it happened. Okay? So that's what we call shogeg. And that's why it still requires teshuvah, because now something's happened to my neshama that is unhealthy for my neshama. And the objective of teshuvah is to clear that away, to fix, to patch that issue. And then you get what is called zedoinos, which is where a person does something dafka. Person gets up from the Shabbos afternoon shlof and says, you know, what I love about Shabbos is the shlof. But this business about not flipping a light switch, get with the program, man. Like, we're living in the 21st century. It's no longer rubbing two stones together to make sparks for, I mean, it's a light switch. I'm going to show you, God, that I think your religion is backward. That's Zodai. That's a whole different business. That's where a person has now chosen to damage their relationship with Hashem. They've chosen to damage their neshama. That's going to require a whole different and more involved kind of teshuvah to fix. Let's go back to our example, the one we've been learning about in Tanya. So the person eats something that's not kosher. Okay, there's various ways that a person could eat something that's not kosher, right? The one way is accidental. What does it mean accidental? God forbid a person is in a medical emergency and the people who treat them in the hospital or on the scene or whatever have to use medications that contain ingredients that are outright non-kosher. It's a very unlikely scenario, but let's just say it happened. I did nothing wrong. Person's got to be cured. There's no discussion over here. Versus the person who inadvertently ate non-kosher. What does it mean to inadvertently eat non-kosher? It's, for example, and I'm sure this has happened multiple times, let's just say, for argument's sake, that there was a particular kosher caterer who wasn't a kosher caterer. And then you inadvertently ate non-kosher, right?
All jokes aside, is something like that spiritual murder?
Yes. Absolutely. If a person consciously feeds non-kosher food to kosher consumers, that is considered spiritual murder. Absolutely. It's a great example, right? So the consumer, though, didn't go dafka, they didn't go to McDonald's, they didn't go to the prawn and clam. They went to a kosher function with a kosher caterer with a Beth Din certificate hanging on the wall, and they ate non-kosher. Is it inadvertent? Yes. Is it accidental? It's not accidental. That conscious intention. The conscious intention to enjoy this food. Did I enjoy it? Yes. One of the best kosher functions I've ever been to. Right? Right? But is there damage? Of course there's damage. So you've got to do teshuvah. Or a person who grows up not having exposure to a religious lifestyle, and they grow up eating non-kosher. It's inadvertent. The person who doesn't have a solid religious Jewish education is not a rebel against God. They're an inadvertent. I didn't know. I didn't understand. I knew Jews don't eat this stuff, but I didn't understand what it's about and why it is. So that's inadvertent. The only way that a person could be a dafkanik, a poshea as we call it, the so-called sinner, so you had to start off from. That's the only way you could be a sinner. You have to know what you're talking about and understand what it means and then elect to do the opposite.
You didn't have to necessarily start off from. You could say, I'm not going to be from because I'm not going to do it.
No. The person who says, I don't want any part of this religion, out of lack of knowledge, cannot be considered a sinner. They can only be considered an inadvertent transgressor because they don't know what it is that they don't. You know the famous line, the God that you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. The Judaism that you don't want to practice, I don't want to practice either. So the guy who makes a statement at some stage in his life, never having had real exposure to what Torah is about, and says, I want no part of it, is not a sinner. That's an inadvertent transgression. Still requires teshuvah, but it doesn't require the same kind of teshuvah as the person who chooses to do what they shouldn't. That's what the Alter Rebbe is talking about. The person who chose, knowingly, aware of what it entails, to eat non-kosher, and they still go ahead and do it. Now they're stuck. Now they're trapped. That was a choice. That was a bad choice. Now you're locked in. How do you get out? How do you get out? You need teshuvah gedolah. You need a very great teshuvah. What is the measure of a very great teshuvah? Or as he calls it, teshuvah gedolah kol kach ad. A teshuvah that is so great that something happens. So in order to understand that, we have to ask ourselves, now that we've defined what aveiros are, now we need to talk about what teshuvah is. So let's go. The guy who falls in the mud. What's teshuvah? Get up, clean up, be careful in the future. That's the teshuvah. The guy who inadvertently threw the rock through the wrong guy's window, or he hit the baseball and the baseball went through the window. So you can't just go there and say, here's your money. You also have to apologize. You have to apologize, right? And then, what happens when a person has intentionally done something to damage or to hurt somebody else? Then they have to go through some kind of a rehabilitation program. Whether it's a prison system, if it's a crime, whether it's a rehabilitation system in the case of an addiction, or whatever it is, the person has to go through some kind of rehabilitation.
But does punishment fit in there?
So what's really interesting, and the Alter Rebbe makes this point later on when he does the treatise on Teshuvah, is that punishment is God's business. So there are certain aveiros that Hashem will mete out a punishment in order to help us through the process. We don't elect to punish ourselves or to punish others, unless of course it's mandated by the Torah. The Torah says clearly, if two witnesses come forward and they can prove X happened, then this is how you deal with it. Okay, well then we follow that. But generally speaking, we are not the arbiters of punishment for others. Okay? So what is this Teshuvah gedolah kol kach? We'll have to learn it next week, Michael.
Sorry, I was thinking about your answer. The question of punishment. Do we expect a punishment? That's the question.
So your question is, do we expect a punishment? It's also a good question. So do we expect a punishment? I think the simplest way to explain that would be as follows. If we believe that rehabilitation is appropriate, then we expect Hashem to do things that will aid that rehabilitation. So if we think of it in terms of punishment, then it feels like he's angry at us and he needs to get back at us, kind of like a vengeful response. Because we did X, so we deserve to be punished. As opposed to a rehabilitative process, which is we expect that he's going to do things to us that will be highly uncomfortable for us to assist us to rehabilitate. So yes, we do expect it, but I think we should be cautious of the word punishment. So I'm going to just say this so we have a little bit of something to go on. So what we're going to describe is there's the kind of teshuvah.
That's your policy, actually.
Of course. It's how we serialize Tanya, we leave cliffhangers at every point. So let's suffice it to say this. we've got to ask ourselves, and I'm going to leave this as a question to think about. We've got to ask ourselves, what would I want to achieve by doing Teshuvah? Now, we can think of this in terms of ourselves and God. We can think of this in terms of ourselves and others. Yeah. So if we've hurt another person or if we've done something that's damaging, what's the objective? What do I want? And it's not something to answer now. It's something to think about. Yeah. What would I want to achieve with Teshuvah? And that will actually be our segue into what the different modes of Teshuvah are, which will bring us back to this one. So the question over here, somebody asked, is a person who ate from non-kosher food unknowingly still needs to do Teshuvah when they get to know about it? And the answer is 100% yes. Absolutely yes. And that's one of the rough things about inadvertent situations, is the damage is damage. You know, for us, spiritual damage is as real as slipping in the mud and cracking a wrist. We don't blame the person for slipping in the mud. The fact is they still need to attend to their wrist. So it's the same kind of thinking.
When somebody slips and breaks a leg or breaks a wrist, is that the punishment of Hashem?
That's a good question. So if a person does slip and injure themselves, is that a punishment from Hashem? I don't know how to answer that in a generic way, because I think each person, when they have their particular misfortune, whether it be an injury, whether it be financial, whether it be whatever, will have to analyze. At the time, was this a correction? Was this a rehabilitation? Was this to wake me up? Was it a brocha? Was it a punishment? Sometimes you'll speak to people who have experiences in their lives that to the rest of us look like they're so debilitating and destructive, and those people will tell us, but this is actually the most blessed thing that ever happened to me. So I really feel it's very individual.
Rabbi?
Yes.
What did